The alarm clock on David's side of the bed didn't just beep, it pulsed with a sense of urgency that he felt in his very bones. It was 4:30 a.m. For David, this wasn't just an early start. It was a ritual. He believed that the world's winners were already 3 coffees deep by the time the sun touched the horizon. He sat up, the blue light from his smartphone illuminating a face that looked tired, yet desperate for a win. He scrolled through global markets, his eyes darting across red and green candles, searching for a sign, a spark, or a ground floor opportunity that would finally validate the years he had spent chasing shadows. Beside him, Alina was a statue of calm. She didn't need a 4:30 a.m. alarm to prove her worth. She woke up at 6 a.m. not to check stock tickers, but to make tea and listen to the birds in the garden. To David, this calmness was a sign of complacency. He loved his wife, but in his mind, she had settled. She had her small consultancy office in the spare bedroom, filled with boring government filing codes and logistics charts. He often looked at her desk and felt a pang of pity. She's content with small things, he would tell himself. That's why I have to be the one to find the big thing. By 8 a.m. The house was a study in 2 different worlds. David was in the kitchen, pacing with his phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking to a man in a different time zone about a revolutionary new mineral extraction process in South America. "Pete," David whispered urgently, leaning against the counter. "If we get the permits now, we're looking at a 10 times return by Q3. It's the play of a lifetime. I just need to move some capital around." Lena walked into the kitchen, dressed in a simple navy blazer and jeans. She was carrying a thick, nondescript manila folder. She poured herself a cup of coffee and listened to the tail end of his conversation. When David hung up, he looked energized, his eyes wide with the frantic glow of a gambler who was sure the next card was the ace. "Big news?" Alina asked softly, leaning against the island. "The biggest L. If this goes through, we're not just talking about paying off the mortgage. We're talking about private jets. We're talking about never having to look at a price tag again. I might have to fly down there next week to scout the site." Alina took a slow sip of her coffee. "David, we've talked about the South America project. You've already put 40,000 into the preliminary phase. Don't you think it's time to see some actual revenue before you pour more in?" David sighed, the sound of a man who felt he was being held back by a lead weight. "That's the problem with your mindset. L. You think in terms of revenue and stability. You're happy working on those little shipping contracts for the local council. But wealth real, world-changing wealth requires vision. It requires risk. You're over here playing checkers, and I'm trying to win at Grandmaster Chess." Lena didn't argue. She never did. She just nodded and glanced down at her folder. On the front, in small, unassuming print, were the words, "Project Aurora, Final Phase RFP." "I have a big meeting today, too," she said, her voice steady. "The one I've been prepping for over the last 18 months. It could change things for the firm." David barely looked at the folder. He reached over and patted her hand patronizingly. "That's great, honey. Really? It's good to have those steady wins. It keeps the lights on while I'm hunting the big game. If you need me to look over your presentation later..." "I can't, though. I'm pretty tied up with the Singapore board call at noon." She realized that her husband didn't actually know what she did. He saw the logistics label and thought she was coordinating delivery vans for local grocery stores. He didn't realize she was architecting a national supply chain network for a government defense initiative. To him, money was something that happened out there in shiny skyscrapers, foreign languages, and in complex schemes. He couldn't conceive of the idea that the biggest contract in the history of their state was sitting on a mahogany desk in the room, next to their bedroom. As the morning progressed, David's world-class day began to fray at the edges. The Singapore call was pushed. The South American contacts stopped answering his texts. The capital he needed to move around was actually the last of their joint savings. And the bank was asking questions he didn't want to answer. He sat in his home officer room decorated with ryes, and grind posters and maps of places he'd never been and. Felt the walls closing in. He looked out the window and saw Alina, getting into her 10-year-old sedan. She looked professional, but unremarkable. She's so lucky, he thought, with a bitter sense of envy. She doesn't have the pressure I have. She doesn't have the weight of the world on her shoulders. She just goes to her little meetings and comes home to her quiet life. He turned back to his computer, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, ready to send another desperate email to a stranger halfway across the globe. He was so focused on the horizon that he didn't see the storm clouds gathering in his own backyard. Nor did he see the sun rising over the empire his wife had already built. The afternoon sun hit David's office window with a harsh, unforgiving glare. He had been sitting in the same ergonomic chair for 6 hours, his neck stiff and his eyes burning from the glow of 3 different monitors. On one screen he had a spreadsheet that was mostly red. On the second, a news feed from a South American mining journal. On the third, his bank portal. The numbers weren't adding up. The guaranteed investment he had made into the mineral extraction project was starting to look like a ghost. He had sent 5 emails to the lead developer in the last 2 hours. For the first time in 6 months, the out-of-office reply didn't trigger. It was just silence. He stood up and paced the small room. He felt like a caged lion, or at least that's how he liked to describe it to himself. In reality, he felt like a man walking on a thin wire over a very deep canyon. He looked at the framed Entrepreneur of the Month certificate on his wall, an award he had essentially paid for by joining a high-end networking group 3 years ago. It felt like it was mocking him. He needed a win. Not just a small win, but a life-altering explosion of capital. He was tired of being the man who was about to be rich. He wanted to be the man who was. Meanwhile, across town, the atmosphere was entirely different. Lydia pulled her modest car into the underground parking garage of a massive glass and steel skyscraper. She didn't look like a woman about to handle a $500 million deal. She wore a simple charcoal suit she'd owned for 4 years and carried a leather briefcase that had seen better days. But as she stepped into the elevator, there was a stillness about her. She wasn't chasing the money. The money had finally found its way to her because she was the only one who knew how to solve the problem. The elevator climbed to the 42nd floor. When the doors opened, she was met by 2 assistants who looked far more important than she did. Yet they treated her with a level of deferred respect that David would have killed for. They led her into a boardroom with a table so long it seemed to disappear into the horizon of the city skyline. There were 12 men and women sitting there, representing the highest levels of the Department of Energy and 2 of the largest construction firms in the country. Lydia, the lead director, said, standing up to shake her hand. We've spent 3 weeks vetting your supply chain model. It's the only one that accounts for the West Coast bottleneck. If we sign this today, can you have the first phase operational by January? Lydia sat down, opened her briefcase, and pulled out a single thumb drive. I wouldn't be here if I couldn't, she said, her voice calm and devoid of the frantic energy David always carried. But we aren't just talking about January. We're talking about a 10-year framework. My firm handles the logistics, the oversight, and the secondary contractors. If you want the security of a closed-loop system, you need my signature as much as I need yours. Back at the house, the silence was broken by the sound of David's phone finally ringing. He lunged for it, nearly knocking over a lukewarm cup of coffee. It wasn't the mining developer. It was a collections agent from a private lending firm. Mr. Sterling, the voice on the other end, was cold and professional. We're calling regarding the bridge loan for your global tech initiative. The grace period ended at noon. We need the full balance of $80,000, or we will have to begin the recovery process against your primary residence. David felt the blood drain from his face. There's been a delay in the Singapore transfer, he lied, his voice cracking. I just need 48 hours. My wife is. She's also closing a big deal today. We'll have the liquidity. 48 hours, Mr. Sterling, not a minute more. David hung up and slumped back into his chair. He felt a wave of nausea. He looked at the door of Lydia's home office. He had always called it her hobby room. He walked in and looked around. It was organized with a precision that bordered on military. There were maps of the country's shipping lanes pinned to the walls, covered in red and blue string. There were binders full of complex regulatory codes. For a brief second, a thought flickered in his mind. What if she actually is doing something big? But he quickly dismissed it. No, he thought. She's just organized. Being organized isn't the same as being a player. She doesn't have the stomach for the big leagues. She's probably just signing a contract to move some crates for a local. In his mind, David convinced himself that if he went to her office or found her at her meeting, he could use his negotiation skills to bump up whatever small fee she was getting. It wasn't much, but it would buy him time. He grabbed his car keys and headed out, his ego still firmly in the driver's seat. He didn't realize that he was about to walk into a room where the small fee had 9 zeros attached to it. He spent the drive rehearsing how he would save Lydia's business by acting as her consultant. He imagined the look of gratitude on her face when he negotiated a better deal for her. As he pulled up to the skyscraper, the same one Lydia had entered hours earlier, he felt a surge of confidence. This was where he belonged. The marble floors, the security guards, the smell of expensive cologne and high-stakes pressure. He walked up to the reception desk, straightening his blazer. "I'm here for Lydia," he said to the receptionist. "I'm her husband and her senior advisor. I believe she's in a meeting on the 42nd floor." The receptionist looked at her screen, then looked back at David with a curious expression. "Mrs. Sterling's meeting is a closed-session executive board meeting, sir. No guests are permitted." "I'm not a guest," David said, his voice rising slightly, the desperation leaking through. "I'm the one who handles the high-level strategy for her firm. Check your records again. It's Project Aurora." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly at the mention of the project name. She picked up a phone and whispered into it. A moment later, she looked at David. "Someone will be down to escort you, Mr. Sterling. Please wait in the lounge." David sat on a leather sofa, feeling smug. "See," he thought. "They hear the name of a real project, and they jump. Lydia probably didn't even tell them she had a partner like me. She's probably in there getting bullied by those corporate sharks. Good thing I showed up." He didn't see the 2 security guards standing near the elevator, watching him closely. He didn't know that Lydia had specifically requested a no-interruption clause in her contract. And he certainly didn't know that the project he was trying to save was currently being discussed in terms that would make his mining investment look like pocket change. Inside the boardroom, Lydia was holding her ground against a final push from the construction firm's lawyer. "The price is the price," she said, leaning back. "You're paying for the fact that I'm the only person in this region who has the bonded insurance and the labor contracts to move this much material in a 90-day window. You can sign, or you can spend 6 months trying to build what I've already spent 5 years perfecting." The room was silent. Then the lead director picked up a pen. "You're a hard woman to bet against, Lydia." Just as he was about to press the pen to the paper, the door at the back of the room opened. David burst in, his face flushed with a mixture of sweat and false bravado. "Lydia, honey." "Sorry I'm late," he called out, ignoring the shocked gasps of the executives. He walked straight toward the table, eyes fixed on the director. "I'm David, the strategist behind the scenes. I think before we sign anything, we need to talk about an escalation clause for the secondary margins. My wife is a bit too modest when it comes to the numbers, but I'm here to make sure everyone gets a fair shake." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. Lydia didn't move. She didn't look angry. She looked at David with a sense of profound, heartbreaking pity. The director looked at the security guards who had followed David in. "Lydia," the director said slowly, his pen hovering over the $500 million contract. "Who is this?" Lydia took a deep breath. She didn't look at the contract. She looked at her husband, who was standing there with a confident grin, completely unaware that he had just walked into a room where he was the smallest person in the world. "This is David," Lydia said, her voice echoing in the vast room. "And he was just leaving." The air in the boardroom felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum. David stood there, his hands still extended for a handshake that no one was going to give him. He looked around the room, expecting to see faces of admiration for his bold entrance. Instead, he saw a dozen powerful people looking at him as if he were a fly that had just landed on a wedding cake. The director, a man whose net worth was measured in 9 figures, didn't even stand up. He simply looked at Lydia and waited. Lydia's face was a mask of professional steel, but her eyes told a different story. For years, she had tolerated David's delusions because she loved him, because she thought his big dreams were harmless. But now he wasn't just dreaming. He was trespassing. He was bringing his frantic, unearned confidence into a sanctuary she had built, brick by brick, with silence and hard work. "Deva," she said again. Her voice lower this time, vibrating with a warning he was too blind to hear. "Go to the lobby. Now." "Lydia, don't be like that," David said, his laugh sounding forced and hollow in the acoustic perfection of the room. He turned to the director, trying to find an ally. "You know how it is, right? The wives handle the paperwork, but we handle the vision. I've been reviewing the Aurora files, and I think we're leaving money on the table. If we adjust the logistics overhead by even 2%, the director held up a single finger. The room went silent instantly. "Mr. Sterling, is it? I'm going to be very clear with you because I value your wife's time, even if you don't. This vision you're talking about. Lydia presented it to us 6 months ago. The 2% you're mentioning? We already negotiated that out of the contract in July because Lydia found a way to automate the railing transition. You aren't bringing us new information. You're bringing us noise." David's smile didn't just fade. It crumbled. He felt a hot, prickly heat crawl up his neck and settle in his ears. He looked down at the table and saw the document. He saw the numbers. He saw the signature line. His eyes scanned the page, looking for the figure he expected to see, maybe 50,000. Maybe 100,000. His heart stopped. He saw a 5 followed by a string of zeros that didn't seem to end. He blinked, thinking his glasses were dirty. He counted the places. Units, tens, hundreds, thousands, millions. $500 million. The realization didn't hit him like a lightning bolt. It hit him like a slow-moving train. The hobby he had mocked. The little shipping job he had used as a backdrop for his own self-importance. It wasn't just a business. While he had been losing $40,000 on dirt in a country he couldn't find on a map, Lydia had been securing the future of their entire lineage. The security guards moved in then, placing firm but polite hands on David's shoulders. He didn't fight them. He felt heavy, as if his bones had turned to lead. As they led him toward the door, he turned his head to look at Lydia one last time. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the director, nodding for him to continue. She had moved on. In that room, David wasn't a partner, a strategist, or even a husband. He was an interruption. The elevator ride down felt like it took an eternity. David stood between the two guards, staring at his reflection in the polished metal doors. For the first time, he didn't see a mogul in the making. He saw a middle-aged man who had spent his prime years chasing ghosts while the real treasure was sitting across from him at the breakfast table every single morning. He walked out of the building and into the bright, indifferent afternoon sun. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from the collections agent. 36 hours remaining. We need the wire confirmation by tomorrow morning. David sat on a concrete bench outside the skyscraper and put his head in his hands. The irony was a physical weight. He was married to a woman who had just signed a $500 million contract, and he was about to lose their house because he couldn't pay $80,000 he had borrowed to look successful. He realized he couldn't even tell her. How do you ask a woman for $80,000 to pay off a debt of ego right after you tried to sabotage the greatest achievement of her life? He used to look at people like that and feel like he was one of them. Now, he felt like a ghost. He thought about all the times he had cut Lydia off when she tried to talk about her day. He thought about the advice he had given her, which was really just him talking to hear his own voice. He remembered telling her once that she lacked the killer instinct to be truly successful. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the pavement, David's phone rang again. It wasn't the bank this time. It was his mother. "David, dear," she said, her voice full of that innocent pride that now felt like a knife. "I saw a news alert on the local business feed. It mentioned the Sterling Group and a massive government contract. I called your father crying. I told him, see, David finally did it. All that hard work paid off. We are so proud of you, son." He wanted to tell her the truth. He wanted to say, "Mom, it wasn't me. It was the woman I ignored. I'm actually broke, and I'm about to lose everything." But the shame was too thick. It's been a long road. He hung up and felt a wave of self-loathing so strong he felt like he might get sick. He was still taking credit for things he hadn't done, even in his defeat. He realized then that his problem wasn't just a lack of money. It was a lack of character. He had built his entire identity on being the big man, and without that mask, there was nothing left but a pile of debts and a broken ego. He finally got into his car and drove home. But he didn't go inside. He parked a block away and watched their house. It was a nice house, but it was modest. Lydia had always insisted on living below their means. David had always pushed for a bigger mortgage, a flashier car, a lifestyle they couldn't afford. He saw the lights in the kitchen turn on. He saw Lydia's silhouette through the window. She was probably making tea. She was probably calm. She had just become one of the most powerful players in the industry. She was likely just doing the dishes. He realized he was terrified to go inside. He was terrified of the silence. In the past, he would have walked in and started talking about his day, drowning out whatever she had to say. But now, for the first time in 15 years, David had nothing to say. The weight of the $500 million contract wasn't the money itself, it was the truth it revealed. It revealed that while David was looking for the elsewhere, Lydia had found the here. And as he sat in his dark car, watching the house he was about to lose, he wondered if he had lost Lydia. Too, the morning sun didn't feel like a new beginning. It felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. David had spent the entire night sitting in his car a block away from the house, watching the soft glow of the lamp in the living room eventually flicker out. He had watched the world go quiet, but his mind was screaming. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those zeros. 500 million. It was a number so large it felt abstract, like a distance to a star, yet it was written on a piece of paper in his own home. When the clock hit 8 a.m., his phone vibrated with a violence that made him jump. It was the bank. Not a text this time, but a call. He let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then he listened to the message. The tone was no longer professional. It was final. They were moving forward with the seizure of assets. The bridge loan he had taken out by putting their house up as collateral was being called in. If the funds weren't in the account by the close of business, the process would become irreversible. David finally started the car. He drove the 100 yards to his driveway, feeling like a stranger in his own life. He walked through the front door, the smell of fresh coffee hitting him like a physical blow. It was such a normal smell for such a catastrophic day. Lydia was in the kitchen. She wasn't wearing her suit today. She was back in her comfortable sweater, sitting at the small wooden table, with a laptop and a simple notebook. She looked up as he walked in. Her eyes were calm, but there was a new distance in the mawa that hadn't been there 48 hours ago. "You didn't come home last night," she said. It wasn't a question, and there was no heat of an argument in her voice. It was just a statement of fact. David slumped into the chair opposite her. He looked at his hands. I needed to think about what happened at the office." "Lydia, I didn't know." "I know you didn't know, David. That's the problem," she said softly, closing her laptop. "You didn't know because you never asked. You never looked. You spent 10 years waiting for a ship to come in from the horizon, never realizing that I was building a harbor right here." David felt the urge to defend himself, the old reflex, to talk about his vision and his bad luck. But for the first time, the words died in his throat. He looked at the woman across from him. He saw the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes. He realized she had been carrying the entire weight of their survival while he played at being a businessman. "The bank called," David whispered, the truth finally leaking out like blood from a wound. "I took a loan. A big one. To fund the South American project. I used the house, Lydia. I used everything. If I don't have $80,000 by 4 p.m., we lose it all. The silence that followed was heavy. He expected her to scream. He expected her to throw him out. Instead, she just leaned back and looked at the ceiling. She didn't look surprised. "I know about the loan, David," she said. David's head snapped up. "What?" "I've known for months. I saw the balances. I was waiting to see if you would ever be honest with me. I was waiting to see if you would trust me enough to tell me you were drowning before the water went over your head." "Then why didn't you say anything?" David asked, his voice trembling. "You have the money? You've had it this whole time. One of your small commissions could have cleared that debt in a second." Lydia stood up, and for the first time, a flash of anger crossed her face. "It wasn't about the money, David. It was about the partnership. You treated me like a supporting character in your life. You treated my work like a hobby. You wanted to be the hero so badly that you were willing to let us go bankrupt just so you could say you were the one who saved us. I didn't step in because I wanted you to see where your path was leading. I wanted you to feel the weight of your own choices." She walked over to the counter and picked up a single check that had been sitting under a magnet on the fridge. She walked back and placed it on the table in front of him. It was already filled out. $80,000. "There it is," she said. "The house is safe. I paid it an hour ago via the online portal. This is just the physical record for our files." David looked at the check. It felt like a lead weight. He had spent years dreaming of writing a check like that. And now that it was sitting in front of him, it felt like a badge of shame. He had been saved by the very person he had spent a decade looking down on. "What happens now?" David asked. Lydia sat back down. "The $500 million contract isn't just a pile of money, David. It's a responsibility. I have to hire 200 people in the next 6 months. I have to manage 3 different state departments. I don't have time to manage your ego anymore. I don't have time to listen to opportunities in Singapore or mines in Brazil." David looked around their modest kitchen. The reality was sinking in. Their life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. They would be moving into circles of wealth he had only read about in magazines. But he wouldn't be entering those circles as the king. He would be entering them as Lydia's husband. For a man who had built his entire soul on being the provider, the leader, and the visionary, it was a total ego death. He realized that if he wanted to stay in this house and in this marriage, he had to let go of the man he thought he was. "I want to help," David said. And for the first time in years, he meant it in a way that wasn't about him. Not as a strategist. Not as a senior advisor. Just ... "Tell me what needs to be done. I'll drive the trucks. I'll file the paperwork. I just want to be on the right team for once." Lydia looked at him for a long time. She was looking for the old David, the one who would take this opening to try and negotiate a VP title. She didn't find him. She saw a man who had finally hit the bottom and found the truth waiting there. "Go wash your face, David," she said, her voice softening just a fraction, "and put on a suit. A real one. I have a meeting with the Port Authority in 2 hours. You can come, but you don't speak. You take notes, you listen, and you learn what a real business looks like." David stood up. He felt a strange sense of relief. The chase was over. The elsewhere was gone. He walked toward the stairs, but he stopped and turned back. "Lydia." "Yes, I'm sorry. For everything." Lydia didn't say it was okay. She didn't say she forgave him yet. She just nodded and opened her laptop. 2 hours, David. Don't be late." As David walked upstairs, he realized the irony was complete. He had spent his life trying to get rich so he could finally relax. Now he was about to be wealthier than he ever dreamed, and he had never been more prepared to work a day in his life. The $500 million contract wasn't his win, it was his second chance. The transition from being the man with the plan to the man holding the clipboard was not an overnight transformation. It was a slow, sometimes painful stripping away of everything David thought he knew about himself. For the first few months, the silence in the car on the way to the new glass-fronted corporate headquarters was heavy. Lydia would be on her headset, directing teams across 3 different time zones, while David sat in the passenger seat keeping track of her schedule on a tablet. He was no longer the one making the noise. He was the one ensuring the noise didn't overwhelm the person actually doing the work. 1 year had passed since the day that $500 million contract had changed their lives. But the change in their home was even more drastic. They had moved, of course, not to a gaudy mansion with gold-plated faucets like David used to brag about, but to a quiet, expansive estate with enough land for Lydia to finally have the massive garden she had always wanted. David found himself spending his Saturday mornings digging holes for rose bushes and laying irrigation pipes. He realized that there was a deep, quiet satisfaction in manual labor, in seeing a job finished correctly that his global ventures had never provided. At the office, the staff had initially been skeptical of him. They knew him as the husband who had nearly derailed the biggest deal in the firm's history. He had to earn their respect from zero. Didn't do it by giving speeches or trying to take over meetings. He did it by being the first one in and the last one out. He became the master of the unimportant tasks, made sure the logistics drivers had their permits on time. And he handled the mundane vendor disputes that Lydia didn't have time for. He was learning that a $500 million operation wasn't built on visionary leaps alone. It was built on a million small things being done right every single day. He saw how Lydia managed people not with the fake charisma he had tried to emulate, but with a steady, unwavering fairness. She listened more than she spoke. When a problem arose, she didn't panic or look for someone to blame. She looked for the bottleneck and cleared it. One rainy afternoon, David was in the warehouse checking a shipment of heavy machinery when his old phone, the one he used to use for his international deals, buzzed in his pocket. It was an email from a former associate, the one who had disappeared during the South American mining disaster. The man was pitching a new once-in-a-lifetime opportunity involving green energy credits in Eastern Europe. A year ago, David's heart would have raced. He would have started calculating his potential millions before he even finished reading the first paragraph. Now he looked at the screen and felt nothing but a dull sense of boredom. He didn't even reply. He simply deleted the email and blocked the sender. He realized that the big win he had been hunting for his whole life was a trap. It was a way to avoid the hard work of actually building something. He put the phone back in his pocket and went back to checking the serial numbers on the crates. He was part of something real now, even if his name wasn't the one on the letterhead. That evening, he drove Lydia home. She looked tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from knowing you've moved the needle. As they sat on their porch, watching the rain hit the trees, Lydia reached over and took his hand. "You did good today, David," she said quietly. "The port manager called me. Said the new scheduling system you put in place saved them for hours on the turnaround. He was impressed." David felt a flush of pride that was different from anything he'd felt before. It wasn't the ego-driven high of a big deal. It was the quiet pride of a man who had finally become useful. "I just wanted to make sure you didn't have to deal with it," David replied. "You have enough on your plate." Lydia looked at him, looked at him, and for the first time in years, the wall in her eyes was completely gone. "The money," she smiled a bit mischievously. "You spent so long looking for it elsewhere. But you finally found the place where it actually comes from. And where's that?" David asked. "The work," she said. "Just the work." The story of David and Lydia became a legend in their small circle, though not for the reasons David once would have wanted. People didn't talk about his vision. They talked about the man who had the humility to lose his ego and find his soul. David realized that he was richer now than he had ever dreamed of being, not because of the balance in their bank account, but because he no longer had to pretend to be someone he wasn't. He had spent his life chasing a mirage in the desert, only to find out that the woman walking beside him had been carrying the water all along. He wasn't the hero of the story, and he was finally okay with that. He was something better. He was a partner. And as the sun set over their quiet home, David knew that the $500 million contract was the least valuable thing they had won that year. They had won their life back. The transition from being the man with the plan to the man holding the clipboard was not an overnight transformation. It was a slow, sometimes painful stripping away of everything David thought he knew about himself. For the first few months, the silence in the car on the way to the new glass-fronted corporate headquarters was heavy. Lydia would be on her headset, directing teams across 3 different time zones. while David sat in the passenger seat, keeping track of her schedule on a tablet. He was no longer the one making the noise. He was the one ensuring the noise didn't overwhelm the person actually doing the work. 1 year had passed since the day that $500 million contract had changed their lives, but the change in their home was even more drastic. Not to a gaudy mansion with gold-plated faucets like David used to brag about, but to a quiet, expansive estate with enough land for Lydia to finally have the massive garden she had always wanted. David found himself spending his Saturday mornings digging holes for rose bushes and laying irrigation pipes. He realized that there was a deep, quiet satisfaction in manual labor and seeing a job finished correctly that his global ventures had never provided. At the office, the staff had initially been skeptical of him. They knew him as the husband who had nearly derailed the biggest deal in the firm's history. He had to earn their respect from zero. He didn't do it by giving speeches or trying to take over meetings. He did it by being the first one in and the last one out. He became the master of the unimportant tasks. He made sure the logistics. Drivers had their permits on time. He checked the safety protocols on the loading docks. He handled the mundane vendor disputes that Lydia didn't have time for. He was learning that a $500 million operation wasn't built on visionary leaps alone. It was built on a million small things being done right every single day. He saw how Lydia managed people not with the fake charisma he had tried to emulate, but with a steady, unwavering fairness. She listened more than she spoke. When a problem arose, she didn't panic or look for someone to blame. She looked for the bottleneck and cleared it. One rainy afternoon, David was in the warehouse checking a shipment of heavy machinery when his old phone, the one he used to use for his international deals, buzzed in his pocket. It was an email from a former associate, the one who had disappeared during the South American mining disaster. The man was pitching a new once-in-a-lifetime opportunity involving green energy credits in Eastern Europe. A year ago, David's heart would have raced. He would have started calculating his potential millions before he even finished reading the first paragraph. Now he looked at the screen and felt nothing but a dull sense of boredom. He didn't even reply. He simply deleted the email and blocked the sender. He realized that the big win he had been hunting for his whole life was a trap. It was a way to avoid the hard work of actually building something. He put the phone back in his pocket and went back to checking the serial numbers on the crates. He was part of something real now, even if his name wasn't the one on the letterhead. That evening, he drove Lydia home. She looked tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from knowing you've moved the needle. As they sat on their porch, watching the rain hit the trees, Lydia reached over and took his hand. "You did good today, David," she said quietly. "The port manager called me. Said the new scheduling system you put in place saved them for hours on the turnaround. He was impressed." David felt a flush of pride that was different from anything he'd felt before. It wasn't the ego-driven high of a big deal. It was the quiet pride of a man who had finally become useful. "I just wanted to make sure you didn't have to deal with it," David replied. "You have enough on your plate." Lydia looked at him, really. Looked at him, and for the first time in years, the wall in her eyes was completely gone. "The money," she smiled a bit mischievously. "You spent so long looking for it elsewhere. But you finally found the place where it actually comes from. And where's that?" David asked. "The work," she said. "Just the work." The story of David and Lydia became a legend in their small circle, though not for the reasons David once would have wanted. People didn't talk about his vision. They talked about the man who had the humility to lose his ego and find his soul. David realized that he was richer now than he had ever dreamed of being, not because of the balance in their bank account, but because he no longer had to pretend to be someone he wasn't. He had spent his life chasing a mirage in the desert, only to find out that the woman walking beside him had been carrying the water all along. He wasn't the hero of the story, and he was finally okay with that. He was something better. He was a partner. And as the sun set over their quiet home, David knew that the $500 million contract was the least valuable thing they had won that year. They had won their life back.